Okay, thanks everybody. We are going to wrap up with our last two presenters today. So we have Karl Schmid from Tulane University and Davey Tomlinson from Villanova University.
Hi, everybody. So the new title for the paper I'm going to be discussing is Seeing Danger and Feeling Afraid. And perhaps this is a sentiment that these days many of us can relate to. I know that at least for me, political climate means that fear feels more prominent than ever. So I want to talk about fear. And in particular, I want to talk about how the Indian Buddhist philosopher Shantideva depicts fear. So I'm fairly new to the philosophy of emotion, so I'm looking forward to our future conversation about the presentation. I once asked Jay about what first inspired him to interpret Buddhist ethics as moral phenomenology. And I want to add here that while many of Jay's insights have been influential to my own understanding of Buddhist philosophy, it's this idea of moral phenomenology that's not only changed my philosophical views, but also my understanding of what it means to be a good person. Jay has offered me incredible support in my academic career and philosophical training, but it's this influence on my own personal ethics that I've found truly invaluable. So thank you. So I once asked Jay about what first inspired him to interpret Buddhist ethics as moral phenomenology. And he answered that he first got the idea from how Shantideva presents fear in his Bodhicharya avatar, which Jay translates as how to lead an wicked life. Jay was inspired by how fear plays such a prominent role in that text. And he describes this stating, but it is the transformation from fear to confidence that is the most salient in the text as a whole, and that best reveals the phenomenology of moral cultivation to which Shantideva draws our attention. So looking at Shantideva's passages on fear from his works, How to Lead an Awakened Life, and his training anthology, I found that Shantideva takes fear in a way that was somewhat puzzling to me at first. He endorses the claim that fear is incorrect, a Buddha. And the way he uses the term I'm translating as fear, Bhaya, suggests that fear involves incorrectly evaluating some object as being a danger. Yet Shantideva's prescriptions for overcoming fear do not target this incorrect evaluation, but instead target our habitual reactions. I'm going to make the case that the best way to make sense of fear in these passages is to think of fear as being quasi-perceptual. In other words, that we can use perception as a model for understanding how fear operates in these texts. Now, that's not to say that Shantideva himself thought of fear as being a type of perception, or to try to identify an essence or intrinsic nature of fear. Instead, I'm making an inference to best explanation, given what we can glean from this discussion on fear from this work. So, I'm going to argue that there are three criteria for any model that aims to make sense of fear in Shantideva's work. Number one, fear incorrectly evaluates its intentional object as being a danger. Number two, fear is recalcitrant to reason. And number three, fear is necessarily automatic and habitual. On the first criteria, the key piece of evidence we have for this is where in his training anthology, Shantideva quotes and endorses the inquiry of Yugara, where it states, quote, what is called fear is an incorrect postulate. Abhuta Parakalpa. This is the closest we come to a definition of fear for Shantideva. Since Shantideva says that fear is always incorrect, this entails that fear has correctness conditions for it. Next piece of evidence for this criteria is how Shantideva commonly describes fear as having a specific object, speaks of the fear of death, pain, even the fear of being in public. And the last piece of evidence for this first criteria is that, as Bronwyn Finnegan has pointed out, Shantideva uses the term Bhaya to mean both fear or danger, alternating between these two meanings of the word. We see these alternate meanings of bhaya as both fear or danger, all the way back to the Buddhist Nikayas. And from this, both Finnegan and the scholar Giuliano Gustorini conclude that for Buddhists, fear construes its object as a danger. The second and third criteria I listed earlier, both stem from Shantideva's prescriptions for overcoming fear. Here he prescribes cultivating the traits of mindfulness and patience as antidotes. How to Live an Awakened Life, chapter 5, verse 3, highlights mindfulness in particular, stating, quote, "But if the elephant of the mind is fully bound by the rope of mindfulness, then all fear subsides, and one arrives at complete." Now, these antidotes for fear might seem puzzling, given that the first criteria for fear, stated before, is that fear evaluates its object as a danger. Why would mindfulness or patience be an antidote to mistakenly judging an object as a danger? Why not use reason to correct our mistaken evaluation? Intuitively, I can be mindful and patient with someone while still judging them to be dangerous. At first glance, it seems as though these prescriptions might miss their mark. However, the conspicuous absence of reason as an antidote for fear actually fits a common intuition that most of us have regarding fear. In fact, this is an intuition that we have about most emotions. Namely, that reasoning is surprisingly limited in how much it can alter our emotions. This is what philosophers of emotion have called emotions recalcitrance to reason. For example, I was thinking of having slides, having a big picture of this. But does everyone here know what harvestmen, or sometimes called daddy longlegs or granddaddy longlegs is? So if you have a fear of spiders, this creature is likely going to bring out that fear. Even if I were to explain to you that the harvestman is in fact harmless, environmentally beneficial, in fact that's not even a spider, you'll still likely probably still feel afraid, right? What this shows us is that reasoning often fails to alleviate our fears. So it makes sense that Shantideva might sideline reasoning when prescribing antidotes to fear. Looking again at Shantideva's prescriptions for overcoming fear, what mindfulness and patience are targeting is not the fact that fear is incorrect when evaluating an object, but instead that this evaluation is made reactively, stemming from our habits. Both mindfulness and patience target reactivity, bringing awareness to the automatic processes built up from habit that link specific stimuli to immediate reactions to said stimuli. Once this process is identified, then we can begin decoupling that link and reconditioning ourselves to prevent those specific reactions. In this case, mindfulness and patience can be used to recondition our habit to immediately and incorrectly evaluate an object as dangerous. So to sum up what I've said so far, I'm arguing that the evidence from Shantideva's depiction of fear suggests that fear is best understood here as wrongly evaluating an object to be in danger, being recalcitrant to reason, and being automatic and reactive, stemming from habit. So any model that we would want that attempts to make sense of fear for Shantideva would have to satisfy these three criteria. We can't, like the Stoics, think of fear merely as any judgment of danger, since this wouldn't be able to satisfy the second and third criteria. Additionally, you can't, like Descartes, think of fear as simply feeling, since this fails to satisfy the first criteria. Instead, we need somewhat of a hybrid of both judgment and feeling. And I'm going to quickly make the case that perception is the best model we have for satisfying all three. Regarding the first criteria, perceptual judgments evaluate their intentional object, attributing some property, such as danger. Regarding the third criteria, perceptions are often reactive. Unlike inferential judgments, our perceptual judgments are automatic, stem from our habits. And lastly, perceptions can be recalcitrant to reason. Here's where our list is helpful. Again, the slides are right. Some of you will immediately know what I'm drawing here, especially if you've ever taken a class with Jay. So this is the Mueller-Lyer illusion, and I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's one of Jay's favorite illusions. So even if I explain to you, and I try to do the best I can here, it's not good. But even if I explain to you that the two horizontal lines here are of equal length, you will continue to see this bottom one as long. And you continue to see it that way owing to, possibly owing to long-standing perceptual habits that have to do with the amount of time we spent in square-shaped rooms. Unlike this one, oddly. So in this way, even our perception can be recalcitrant to reason. No matter how much I try and convince you that these are equal, you'll still continue to see this one as well. So there's these three criteria that this idea of perception as a model for fear helps satisfy. Another advantage of this model relates to how fear is experienced. We are all probably aware of how much of a bodily and visceral experience fear can be. Perceptions have similar intensity to them, which might be lacking in other types of evaluations, such as inferential judgments. And I should note that I'm arguing that fear for Davey should be thought of as quasi-perceptual, right? That perception is a good model for understanding it. Not that it simply is a type of perception in and of itself. There's still some really important differences. One of the most important here is that I'm not saying that fear could be defined by any particular sense modality. Instead, fear would be multimodal. It can occur in our seeing, our hearing, even our mental introspection. Because of this, a particularly pervasive fear could permeate our entire experience of the world. It's this kind of all-inclusive fear that Shantideva describes when he describes the fear of death in the second chapter of How to Be an Awakened Mind. We experience the world through the lens of our fear of death, and thus we perceive danger at every turn. As a final point, I want to say that I think that this model for understanding fear fits well within an interpretation of Buddhist ethics as moral phenomenology. If the goal of our ethical development is a holistic transformation of our moral comportment, one of the most crucial aspects of that is the ability to attend to the habitual and reactive ways that we categorize objects in our experience. Shantideva informs us that mindfulness and patience can help us attend to these reactions and thereby begin the process of limiting the influence fear has over our lives. Thank you. This goes away for you. I'm listening.
No. Right. So hi. It's a bit overwhelming to be here, and it's a great honor. I realized, thinking recently, that I've known Jay now for more than half my life, and there are like so many of Jay's proud kids here and elsewhere. There's so many reasons, both personal and professional, that I would not be in this field, and this field would not be what it is without you. So, profound thanks. Okay, so my paper is called How to Be Someone Else, Moral Phenomenology, Tantra, and the Power of Imagination. And the dovetailing with some of the things that Karl said are wonderful kind of connections. So in Jay's turn to ethics over the last 15 years, moral phenomenology has stood out as a principal theme. He's developed this idea across a series of important articles and books. Moral phenomenology, Jay writes, is an approach to ethics in which the principal object of concern and of moral evaluation is the way one experiences the world, including oneself, other moral agents, and especially other moral agents. This sets it apart from more familiar meta-ethical theories some contemporary authors have used as frameworks to approach Buddhist ethics. Opposed to these, Jay argues that moral phenomenology better reflects a deeply Buddhist concern with affecting transformation at the level of experience in the first place, rather than action. That is, as he writes, ethical practice is about the transformation, not in the first instance of what we do, but of how we see. Shantideva's Bodhicharya Karl, as we've already heard, in Jay's Buddhist translation of How to Lead an Awakened Life, has been one of his lodestars in this project. In his article, What is it like to be a Bodhisattva, Jay describes Shantideva's work as devoted to, quote, an account of the cultivation of moral sensibility and moral experience. Shantideva presents exercises, reflections, and arguments, all with the aim of transforming experience in accordance with the rational examination of the way things really are, empty of intrinsic being, interdependent, and having only conventional identity. Throughout, Jay argues, Shantideva's ultimate aim remained consistent, to train us to see what's real so that the distinction between prudential and moral concern dissolves and we act spontaneously with a kind of compassionate responsiveness for the benefit of all beings. Today, I'd like to quickly sketch out a way that we might extend this idea of moral phenomenology into the ethics of Buddhist Tantra in particular. Thinking about Tantric ethics in terms of moral phenomenology at Schmid will help us better understand both the innovations Tantra brings to Buddhist philosophy as well as some of its continuities with earlier Buddhist ethics. And we'll return to Shantideva later. Buddhist Tantra marks a fundamental shift in thinking about the nature of Buddhahood and the path to it. In exoteric Mahayana thought, experiential knowledge of what Buddhahood is like is inaccessible to us. We might learn about Buddhahood's characteristics third-personally in sutras and doctrinal texts, but the first-hand experience of Buddhahood is something that we achieve only upon awakening. For many Tantric authors, on the other hand, what Buddhahood is like is accessible to us here and now. In a series of rites that came to be known as the higher initiations, initiates have a first-hand experience of being a Buddha, its distinctive bliss, its empty radiant awareness, and even the unique enjoyment of a Buddha's subsequent activity. This experience is accessible first personally, and not just from the perspective of doctrine, before one is really awakened. So in Tantric ethics, what comes to structure self-transformation is not the phenomenology of stages along the path of Bodhisattva Buddha, but the phenomenology of Buddhahood itself. We move from a more general Mahayana concern with Jay's question, what is it like to be a Bodhisattva, to the question, what is it like to be a Buddha? Initiation makes possible various practices that reimagine and manipulate the experiential knowledge of Buddhahood that one gains in the glimpse. One of these post-initiatory practices is deity yoga, or the cultivation of union with the deity. This is, to borrow a phrase from David Schulman, a yoga of the imagination, in which one quite literally imagines being a Buddha. The practitioner first cultivates insight into emptiness. Next, after visualizing the whole world dissolving into the empty radiance of awareness, the practitioner recreates the universe in imagination as a Buddha's mandalic palace, adorned with finery and resounding with songs, with a particular Buddha at its center. Then, in an act of what philosophers today would call a kind of experiential imagination, the practitioner identifies with this image of the central deity, the Devata Ahara, abandoning their ordinary ahankara, their ordinary identity, and inhabiting the identity of the deity. All this gradually convinces the practitioner of their being that Buddha, as their self-regard and experiential habits are reconditioned in order to accord that self-image. As their experience is transformed, their actions follow suit. Once these awakened habits become deeply ingrained, the practitioner's conviction that they are a Buddha is no mere false projection. They have in fact become something else. So let's consider a concrete example. Ratnakara Shanti's early 11th century Deity Yoga sadhana, the Brahmahara, lays out extensively the method for transforming oneself into the 16-armed and 8-faced Hevajra. After the practitioner rehearses a Yogacara-style argument for non-duality and dissolves everything into emptiness, ornate imagery is imagined in detail as the practitioner rebuilds the world as a purified Buddha realm, with Hevajra united with his consort at the center. Once this is all visualized clearly, the practitioner inserts himself into the picture. Finally reborn as Hevajra, the practitioner now regards all of this as their own form. Hevajra's colors, sounds, and adornments, his gestures, his wrathful countenance, his blissful enjoyment, all of it is inhabited first person. As Ratnakara says, borrowing from the Hevajra Tantra, one should see oneself, Atman Tashir, according to the following description. Striking the ground with my feet, menacing gods and asuras, I am wrathful, my round eyes red, elegant and youthful. I have 4 legs, 8 faces, adorned with 16 arms. I stomp on the 4 Mars at my feet in a fierce dance, my legs crossed, and so on. Despite its violent aspect, for the practitioner who has learned and internalized the right set of correspondences, this imagery signifies certain awakened dispositions that are at the root of these images, dispositions that the practitioner is aiming to adopt. So, borrowing again from the Hevajra, Ratnakara says a little later that one should develop the conviction that, quote, my eyes are red due to compassion, my body is dark due to my mind's kindness, my 4 feet that are stomping on those Maras are the means used to attract disciples, my arms the 16 emptinesses, I'm wrathful to instruct those who are corrupted, and so on. All this imagery is ultimately unreal, empty of intrinsic being, devoid of duality, like an illusion. And yet its transformative effect is profound. Assuming the deity's image as a guise lets the practitioner identify with the various awakened dispositions that this imagery is taken to express. In other words, I don't just see myself as having red eyes when I identify with Hevajra's image. Gradually, I come to see myself as embodying Hevajra's compassion, which is expressed in affect and action, as well as in the red color of my eyes that I'm imagining. As I slowly am convinced by the guise that I've imagined, this fundamentally changes how I see myself, the world, and those around me, and so changes how I act in that world. This imagery, this functions like an actor's costume and gesture. All the accoutrements of the theater that help the actor inhabit their role and properly express their character's dispositions and emotions. Deity yoga is sometimes referred to as the Buddha's dance, the drama of Buddha, the Buddha Nataka. The practitioner is inhabiting a role on the stage of imagination. The Sanskrit word for the imagery that's involved here, akara, also has this sense of gesture, ingita in Sanskrit literature more generally. It is a gesture that signifies some emotional state, as V.S. Update's dictionary has it, an expression of the face as giving a clue to one's inward thoughts or mental disposition. Indeed, as Ali has argued, in classical India, every emotion was tied to a gesture of this kind. As Ali writes, emotions in this world were never viewed as exclusively or even sufficiently internal states. All affective states had gestural and behavioral symptoms, end quote. And these symptoms could be manipulated by spies and the king's courtiers, by men and women about town looking to further their romantic aims, and most paradigmatically by actors who are conveying emotions on stage. It's no accident that practitioners of deity yoga say of themselves, in the guise of Hevajra, I express the 9 rasas of drama. They are playing a part, and with enough repetition, the new self-image they imagine and the gestures that they make let them see themselves as having all the emotions that they've learned to correspond to these. Eventually, they'll come to play the role automatically, expressing awakened dispositions in all their thought and action. Jay has also recently drawn attention to the relevance of drama for thinking about our conventional existence as selfless persons in Steve Collins' wonderful expression. The English word person, he notes, quote, derives from the Latin persona, literally denoting the mask of the kind worn in the theater and metonymically denoting a role. To be a person is to play a role. The person you are is constituted by the multiple roles that you play, end quote. Of course, our script is not written in advance, waiting on the page to be given voice. Rather, as we go through our conventional existence, the personae that populate our drama are created, not discovered, end quote. This creation is an ever-unfolding process that involves conventions and customs, shared narratives, intersubjectivity, and embodiment. Proponents of deity yoga similarly recognize that Buddhahood itself essentially involves this kind of personhood. It is not a bare emptiness, nor is it, as some tantric authors will argue, a spontaneous emergence out of the empty radiance of awareness. It is rather generated through active training and enculturation. The new role needs to be inhabited fully to such an extent that one's previous sense of self, or of personhood, better, is replaced by the deity guise. And when this finally happens, what the practitioner sees and how they respond to it is fundamentally changed. They, to borrow again from Jay, they completely inhabit their roles, becoming the roles they embody instead of experiencing themselves as performing those roles. Like an actor lost in their part, a practitioner who has attained union with a deity has fully assumed that identity, the devata's ahankara, as their own. How they see and what they do is now forever shaped by this new persona. So deity yoga utilizes this power of experiential imagination to let us inhabit these other perspectives. And it does this with the help of the guise of the deity and all of this other vivid mental imagery. Proponents of deity yoga, this faculty of imagination, however, was utilized in earlier Buddhist ethics as well. Considering other instances of this power at work will help us make sense of the continuities between moral phenomenological practices in Tantric and non-Tantric Buddhist ethics. And for want of time, we have just one case. Jay's Lodestar, Shantideva. Shantideva's work utilizes experiential imagination in different places, but perhaps most striking is the exchange of self and other. As Janet Gyatso observes, this involves, quote, the practice of substituting one's own perspective on oneself with that of another. That is, this supreme secret, as Shantideva calls the practice, utilizes the experiential imagination to inhabit another and then look back at oneself. Here we don't find the kind of visualization that we have in deity yoga, with all of its complex mental imagery and sets of conventional correspondences. Instead, we find a kind of narrative exhortation, what Janet Gyatso calls a kind of spontaneous ventriloquy, direct quotations that are spoken or thought by the new self while other. Though the practice begins in earnest at Bodhicharyavatara 8.140, its logic is first outlined earlier. As Shantideva writes at 8.111 and 112, due to habituation, the awareness of an I occurs regarding drops of blood and semen that are distinct from oneself, even though no real thing exists. In the same way, why not apprehend myself? Why not apprehend as myself the body that belongs to another, too? For the otherness of my own body is indeed proven. It is not hard to accept. Or again, as he says toward the conclusion of the exercise, now utilizing the word ahankara in an evidently positive sense. Therefore, just as you construct an identity in ahankara regarding drops of semen and blood that are distinct from yourself, you ought to cultivate an identity regarding others, too. All the time, we fashion ourselves regarding what is not in fact self. We know this by now in Shantideva, and we know that this is the root of suffering. But here, Shantideva utilizes this self-fashioning for the sake of ridding oneself of self-grasping and cultivating compassion. We are already in the habit of appropriating what is not self as if it is ourself, Shantideva says, so why not appropriate the first-person perspective of those we ordinarily take to be others? The inhabitation of any first-person perspective is always a performance. The script that Shantideva gives us then in the verses that follow help us put on various other personae. In the first place, the perspective shift contributes to the shattering of our egotism and pride as we look back at ourselves from the outside and see firsthand what others might really think of us. Further, as the reader of Shantideva's ventriloquy gets lost in the sea of switching first and second person pronouns, the fluidity of these various particular subjectivities is revealed in a kind of destabilization of one's own subject position, as Janet Gyatso writes. Finally, projecting oneself into another's perspective generates empathy that lingers after the meditation session is ended. By rechanneling identification with one's own body into this temporary identification with the body of another, Stephen Harris writes, craving for one's own benefit is transformed into the aspiration for the benefit of others. The exchange of self and other practice, then, is a quintessential expression of Shantideva's moral phenomenology. Learning to see oneself from a concrete other's vantage confounds the distinction between prudential and moral concern. Now, Shantideva does not suggest that we utilize the experiential imagination to imagine ourselves as Buddhas, as we find in deity. The perspectives that we inhabit in the exchange are those of others in our social sphere. Shantideva's examples are other denizens at Nalanda, people of lesser, equal, and greater status. But the emphasis on this special power of imagination and the desirability of using it to manipulate, rather than to straightforwardly abandon the sense of identity in order to inculcate certain habits of seeing. This, I think, is very much in line with practices of deity yoga that were just beginning to proliferate in Shantideva's day. Okay, so there are many ways that we might imagine ourselves to be someone we're not. And throughout its history, Buddhist ethics has utilized this capacity to help us change how we see. It is a crucial engine of moral progress, one of those means by which, as Jay puts it, our perceptions may be changed, our perceptual skills honed, and our dispositions shaped, a means much more effective than theoretical discourse. Through engagements with narratives, aspirational prayers, and exoteric meditation practices like Shantideva's exchange, our ability to project ourselves into other perspectives is used to transform first what we experience and then what we do. The Tantric practice of deity yoga takes this to an extreme, given the in-principle availability in imagination of a Buddha's experiential perspective after one has gone through initiation. But still, it is part of a longer genealogy of yogas of the imagination in Buddhism. And I hope that seeing deity yoga through Garfield's moral phenomenological lens can help us refocus discussions of tantric ethics, giving us a clearer picture of both Tantra's novelty as well as its continuity with the Buddhist tradition, one that highlights the importance of experiential imagination in practices of self-transformation more generally. Thank you. Yeah, please.
I have a small question about the imagining of becoming a Buddha. Okay, imagining a Buddha, imagining my state of mind being that of a Buddha, and therefore I understand that that would transform me in idealistic ways. The paradox for me is that I am not a Buddha, and my imagination of being a Buddha is therefore incorrect.
Yeah.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
And to assume that I understand what it means to be a Buddha, because I'm imagining it, right, is fundamentally flawed, and therefore potentially, leads to all sorts of problems, right?
Yeah.
As you know.
Yeah.
So we have lots of examples of political tension, right, within Buddhist groups, because leaders of groups imagine themselves to have that kind of ability, right?
Yeah.
And therefore they have a kind of egregious self-confidence that they know what the right thing to do is. Let's move forward here.
Yeah.
So how do you understand that problem?
Yeah, so I understand that problem. My work has been focusing really on the kind of Sanskrit debates about this stuff from the 8th to 12th century or so. And the same problem is raised in critiques of deity yoga in that period. So Indrabhuti's Jnanasiddhi is a famous example of this, where he says, look, imagining yourself to be a king day in and day out isn't going to make you a king. In the same way, the false idea that you are a Buddha isn't going to make you a Buddha. No matter how long you think about it, right? Because you are not a Buddha, or else you wouldn't need to do the cultivation in the first place, right? There's a kind of it's obvious that you're not a Buddha in the relevant sense, because you need to do the cultivation. Therefore, imagining yourself to be a Buddha is false. And just like the false construction, I am a king, isn't going to make me a king, the false construction, I am a Buddha, isn't going to make me a Buddha. And there are a number of different ways that proponents of deity yoga respond to that objection. One of them is to double down on the power of the imagination. They'll often cite these verses on yogic perception to this effect. They'll say that it actually doesn't matter whether it's true or false. Anything you cultivate long enough will generate a vivid experience. And so even though you are not a king, cultivate it long enough and you will become a king. And over a kind of longue durée, multiple rebirth view, where everything is mind only anyway, that'll work. And they actually will cite sometimes Shantideva as evidence of this, because he says things like the exoteric perfections are all mind only. Another response is to double down on the power of initiation. And this, I think, is crucial. If you really think that initiation gives you experiential knowledge of what Buddhahood is like, then you get a little fleeting glimpse where you can check the accuracy of your, that kind of checks the accuracy of your imagining, and it also maybe even makes possible certain kinds of imagining that wouldn't be possible without it. So it's often the case that opponents of deity yoga will also be opponents of the idea that initiation actually gives you a glimpse. They'll argue instead that post-initiatory practices are where you actually finally get a glimpse of what Buddha is like. And
I guess what I'm really thinking about is deity yoga works. I can understand that. I can understand imagining I'm a king and understand imagining I'm whatever.
Yeah.
But imagining that I'm a Buddha seems to be a completely different dimension, right?
Yeah.
Because the Buddha's thinking is not my thinking, and I cannot possibly assimilate that until I reach that, right? Everything else is just speculation. Everything else is imagination. And by definition, a lot of people think that's bad, that's dangerous, that's, distorting, that's perverse, et cetera,
Yeah.
So, I mean, that seems to be, that's why I understand these two things fit together really well, and it's attractive.
Yeah.
But there just seems to be such a fundamental problem with it.
Yeah, I mean, the last feature though is that this is again something that's glimpsed in initiation. You are in fact,
Some part, put this out to say, yes.
Yeah. And so the kind of imagining and the initiation gives you an experiential glimpse of what that's like. And so,
So in some sense, the thought of the Garfield is at the heart of this, right?
Yeah.
Because there is this presumption that there is a nature of society, and therefore, it is possible, right? It is conceivable, right, that this could actually work, right?
yeah, that you can catch the glimpse and then that the cultivation can make some sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to respond to that and then lead into my question, which in Transland was, and to say that there's like a good visualization at the beginning of the largest Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, which is a foundational text in Pure Land Buddhism. It's said in Vulture Peak, and Buddha's at the center giving a talk. But you can sort of draw a mandala with that, provided that you know the context. So there's like 12,000 monks that are there, but in names, the largest Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra mentions 4 Mahasattvas, Manjushri, Samantabhadra, and Maitreya. They mention 15 lay bodhisattvas, which they translate into English, and then 32 bhikkhus. 31 bhikkhus, excuse me. And so the total that you get is 1 Buddha in the center, 3 Mahasattvas, 15 lay bodhisattvas, and then 31 bhikkhus. But you can't draw a mandala without the correct multiplicity, and in fact, you have to add 1 to each of those, because how the text is designed is that the Buddha is included in the count of the total bhikkhus, in the total mahasattvas, and the total lay bodhisattvas, which gives you 1, 4, 16, and 32. And so what this is supposed to establish with the corresponding text, which says that the Buddha was once a monk, the Buddha was once a lay bodhisattva, and the Buddha is finally the Buddha at the center. What that's supposed to visualize is transcendental Buddhahood, which is to say that it goes beyond the point in space and time, Vulture Peak, when the Buddha was preaching of the path of Buddhahood. It really transcends the spatial, the space-time plane.
Just one thought on this, though. I mean, I do think that the form is important, and that's part of why the imagination, it's not an abandonment of personhood, right? I think it's a kind of, it involves a kind of form at the end, and the performance of that form is the crucial part.
And I would say that with Pure Land, it's like the Buddha was within you. But then with Tantra, I guess my question is how do you visualize that if you have these diagrams? If you have art and architecture, is that an important?
Yeah, I think it is. The interactions between the visualization practice and the art kind of maybe go back.
And the seed syllables.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all a crucial part of it. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I didn't have time to go through all of them. Jake, do you have a question?
No, I was just enjoying.
Are there any other? Yes.
Yeah, my understanding of deity yoga is that we already falsely identify with a self that we're not,
Right.
and that in deity yoga we're actually identifying with something that's more true to who we actually are than what we conventionally believe. And that an important part of the yoga, I really enjoyed your talk, by the way, but an important part of deity yoga is at the end that there's a completion stage of letting go completely comes again
Yeah.
into just vivid awareness. And
Yeah.
that whether it's by loosening the identification with a false self or the identification with this imagined self that's actually closer to our true nature in the sense of being awareness and compassion and whatever other attributes, that there's some kind of open experience there that goes beyond thought and beyond duality. And that's really where the practice reaches its fruition.
Yeah. This is a topic, as like all things, a topic of much debate. And so there are some components of deity yoga in the Sanskrit material, and I think Saltapan and Kadric side this way too, to an extent, where you're, even on the completion stage, you don't completely abandon the deity form. And the deity form is actually, and the deity identification, that form of ahankara, it's part and parcel throughout the process. Because if you abandon that, you abandon the form embodiment, so you're just a Dharmakaya and you're not going to do anything. But I think I appreciate that point.
So I had a question for Karl. So one thing that struck me when I was listening is you suggested this intuition that, you know, emotions are recalcitrant to reason. And I think there's a sense in which that's an intuition somewhat sure, but there's also, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy works in some way because of the responsiveness of emotions to reason. And it seems like Shantideva is also engaging in argumentation throughout the Bodhisattva. So I guess my question, I have a couple of questions. I want to hear more about what you think an emotion is for Shantideva, kind of your textual evidence for it. And so it's kind of like, let's small question, right? But to put it's easy, yeah. But to put a kind of fine point on it, it sounded like what you were saying was that you're thinking of emotion in a hybrid sense, where it's feeling sort of physiological stuff going on, and it's also a judgment component. On that view, though, that seems like the recalcitrance is in the feeling, not necessarily in the judgment. And so you might think that, well, once you have, say, this kind of, what we call it fear, where you don't have the judgment any longer, but you have an automated sort of physiological response, for some theorists that would not constitute really an emotion of fear anymore. It's something else, right? And so I'm curious about how you're understanding that in the context of Shantideva.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let's start with the easy question. What is an emotion for Shantideva? I actually think it is somewhat an easy question because emotion, I don't think is a good term to try and map onto Buddhist philosophy. Right. It starts getting used, I think, in the mid-1800s. Is that right? I'm looking at the person whose work I learned that when reading. And it's not exactly clear that the way we use the term emotion maps onto any kind of natural kind. So even though I refer to things from the contemporary philosophy of emotion, I hope my talk centers on fear, right? Because fear is something that is more clearly defined there. I don't know a lot about CBT, to answer the first part. However, it's I believe what's going on there is not simply reasoning. It's actually changing the habits of thought. If it were reasoning, it would be a lot simpler, right? I mean, in fact, a lot of the problems wouldn't be problems, right? If you were having obsessive thoughts, all you would have to do is be convinced that you're having obsessive thoughts and you shouldn't have them. You believe, oh, I don't want to have these obsessive thoughts anymore, and you're done, right? But instead, it's the fact that those thoughts are habitual that's the problem. And so in that way, I believe that similarly, therapies of that kind are getting at that kind of habitual nature, or aiming at that habitual nature, like the kind of antidotes that Shantideva gives. And for the last part, by using perception as a model here, and of course I'm like, I'm talking about a certain theory of perception, right? I'm aiming to give an idea of something in which judgment and feeling are wed together, right? And I know some people will think differently about perception here, but we could use a different term like observation or something, right? And so in that way, you can't separate them out into two parts. Now, you can have judgments that are different from perceptual judgments, right? You can have inferential judgments, right? And in fact, I think that if we think about fear as being like a perceptual judgment, that means that even if we were to become fearless, we could still make the inferential judgment that something is dangerous. And that helps explain that problem that we might have at first of thinking about perception as an evaluation of an object. I'm sorry, fear as an evaluation of an object that takes it as a danger, and then we develop mindfulness and patience. But can't we still judge things to be dangerous? And the answer would be yes, but these would be inferential judgments of that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, Because there are lots to talk about.
Yeah, there's like 3 different,
It's a way to think about that as kleshas being intentional because being, I'm just, you didn't say
intentional,
klesha,
yeah.
but I'm saying
yeah.
because of being part of mind, and that's what mind is intentional. It's oriented towards an object. That's what unifies the different factors. And
Totally.
Very academic about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, I went through it super quickly there, but the evidence for Shantideva taking fear to be intentional, the most obvious is, and perhaps kind of a little bit weaker, but the most obvious is that he talks about the object of fear all the time. He says the fear of death, the fear of being in public, which is a lot, right? But the larger sort of theoretical, the larger theories from philosophy might behind that also back that idea up.
Yeah.
I thank you both for the talks. I'm just trying to think about this whole issue of fear, because what's interesting is that fear is not in the Abhidhamma anywhere, really, and it's not something Buddhists are not interested in thinking about psychologically. And so, to me, part of the key, and that feels like for us, right, fear is like any basic, one of the most basic emotions, right? So bedrock is emotion. The fact that bhaya means both the danger or threat and fear seems to me something we should lean into a little bit. And so that when you say that it's so much about the object, it's like, maybe let's really push into that, because the fear of death, death is a threat to us. So that how fear might be working in a lot of this is as this kind of threat or danger. And less is this kind of psychological thing that we have to figure out with English psychological vocabulary, because Buddhists thought a lot about how we work psychologically, and they never seem to spend a lot of time on fear. I mean, you find it in the sources, and this sort of working this way and that way, but it's not a major category. Sure, but that, so that made me ready to get more into, so I just wonder if you leaned into that other side of fear, that it's a danger.
Yeah.
You would wind up not having to kind of psychologize something that Buddhists themselves often did not psychologize at all.
Yeah, I would say that it depends on, the emphasis on fear probably depends on which Buddhists you're talking about. I think that Shantideva does emphasize fear a lot. I see
He
it.
emphasizes it as a danger. We should fear death. We should perceive the death as right with death. He himself, another kind of interesting is that, I'm just thinking about Kate's paper, how much he's trying to instigate fear, right? And, so.
Yeah,
Isn't the 108 calculations, isn't fear among that list? I don't know.
I don't know that specific list. There's lots of lists of the kleshas. I think that danger is an extremely important part of this, right? I could go back through it and think about it, but I don't think that you could simply translate what he's saying as danger, or whenever used by, I just think about it as danger. But I think that, to borrow a way of distinguishing or talking about things such as fear from Western philosophers, sometimes we talk about emotions as having its intentional object and its formal object, right? And the formal object is the way that you evaluate that particular intentional object. You're right, actually, that the intentional object is less important than the formal object. And so there's a much closer association. The way that we carve out what constitutes fear is less dependent upon the intentional object, right? I could have a fear of iPads, for instance, right? But what is necessary is that formal object of seeing it as a gift. So that connection, I think, is really close.
I think it's also important to remember that Shantideva uses fear in several different ways in Bodhisattva. So he begins with a diagnosis of fear as this kind of primal framing way of taking up with the possibility of death, with reality of death, that is a source of vice. And so he sees fear as the root of all the kleshas. But then he turns around and tries to cultivate a fear as a motivation, right? I say, I won't die today, don't worry, it's not going to come to you. Yes, you will, right? Or you might. And so he cultivates fear as a way of escaping that first fear, the primal kind of unthematic framing fear. And they're slightly different attitudes, and so they have to be thematized and analyzed a little bit differently. Because the first one really is a klesha. The second one is a virtuous motivator. But only for a while. You don't need it forever, right? Only until you've got a little further along the way.
Yeah,
I think that's worth thinking about.
yeah. In the paper, I get into that, and this is a shorter presentation. That is the topic on fear that most Buddhist scholars pick up, which is called the paradox of fear. One of the things that I think is helpful here, and let me know if you disagree, is that what Shantideva is up to in his positive account of fear, his use with what he finds useful in fear, or rather than the reason that he evokes fear in his audience, in the ways that Dave was talking about, is that it can help us recognize and become more aware of this pervasive fear of death that we always, that is always distorting our experience, but that we're not entirely aware of. It's somewhat opaque, right? And so this is where, again, this model of perception could be useful. You can take the example of someone on the shoreline looking out into the ocean, and there's something vaguely there, right? And Shantideva would be there to point at that and say, that's a ship. What you're looking at is a ship, right? So we can have this perception of something, and we have some ways of defining it that are mistaking it to have the wrong object. We think that we're afraid of public speaking, when in fact that has to do with our fear of death, eventually. Really, it all goes back to the fear of death. So again, in that similar manner, it's important to recognize those kind of multiple uses of fear in his work, and the way it can be instrumental, I think.
Can I ask a question? Can you train yourself not to see your liar?
You a liar.
Because I feel like
Most people can.
but can some.
So some people claim to be able to.
Okay.
But if so, that is a really sophisticated transformation.
Yeah.
I mean, it would take a lot of work, and I'm not sure that it's even true that people can, but there are people who claim that they can train themselves.
Yeah, because I was thinking back to Malcolm's question about like what exactly the role of reason is in Shantideva's text in your account, because like it does make some difference, I think, for Shantideva, even, but like certainly for Garfield, that the rational reflection, I mean any repeated cultivation can transform, but you should only do the ones that are grounded on reality. If you want, like, real situation.
And I think it's important to know Shantideva offers all those arguments. Think about chapter 6, right, on anger.
Yeah.
He always follows them with exercises.
Yeah.
The arguments are meant to convince you ought to do your exercise.
Yeah.
But you still got to go to the gym.
But they're also meant to convince you, well, to make the exercise have a true object.
That's right, that's right.
Right,
Tell you what to do, you've got to follow the instructions. Not just that you've got to do it, but here's how to do it. But then you still got to do it.
Yeah, it's like if you want to get, to use the gym example, if you want to get strong, right, someone's going to say, you need to lift these weights, and you're going to say, why? And they're going to give you an explanation of what happens when you lift those weights. But at the end of that explanation, you are not strong. Like, you just know why doing that exercise makes you strong. Now, the reasoning was helpful there, right? It was helpful in you figuring out the process.
Well, and it's not what the thing to do that will make you strong.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the point.
That's the good idea.
I was just going to point out the illusion. So this is cultural context is one place where the illusion seems to fall apart as certain African tribes suggest. There's debate about this.
There's big debate about that, and that data is extremely soft.
Yeah.
That data is extremely
And
soft.
they've done some computer simulations that seem to suggest that this effect still continues even in a sort of non-human kind of context.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to add something to that, right? There's an example that I've thought about a number of times in terms of the transformation of extreme transformations in that way, maybe not of the Mueller liar illusion, but of fear. There is an individual named Alex Honnold, who is a famous rock climber. Ever seen the movie Free Solo? Yeah. And they put him in an MRI. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so I think it's the amygdala. It's like pixel right up the screen. It's unclear, but they believe that it is a mixture of both having a natural proclivity and also training himself in that way. Mostly because he reports having been scared before he begins, right? And so that to me suggests that again, that idea of whether you can train yourself out of the Mueller liar illusion, I don't know, but these kinds of really intense transformations that the Buddhists propose, and in some ways the Buddhist project relies on, the possibility of that they might be possible. All the way in the back? Yeah, that was you.
I was going to say, also, I think that what Shanti gave is that he says that if we perceive things correctly, we realize that the greatest danger is the untamed mind, that it can do more harm than any worldly entity. So there's something about correct perception as well in regard to danger in his teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? The untamed mind there that you said, that, and that really directly relates to that verse on mindfulness. And for me, untamed, again, goes back to that notion of habit. But similarly, right, the problem, there's many problems with fear, but one of the problems is that it's incorrect for Shanti Davey. And it's incorrect because it stems from this mistaken sense of self.
So, yes. Okay. So thank you, Karl and Davey.